and gentlemen, I have this pleasure and honor today to welcome you to the next webinar of Logic and Religion Association. It's very nice that this webinar still gains so great interest. We are very happy. And maybe two announcements. We, of course, still are thinking about the November Congress, the third Congress on Logic and Religion, and we still invite all of you to take part in this Congress. And the second thing that we are working also to somehow formalize our association. So we are keep moving, and we will register it next year. We hope it will be a good solution for all of us to organize such events like our congresses. And today we have a fantastic speaker and a fantastic chair, who is Professor Ricardo Silvestre, the president of our association and a professor at the Faculty of Philosophy in the University of Campina Grande. So Ricardo, welcome. A great logician and also animator of our scientific life, academic life. So please, Ricardo, continue, and thank you very much for inducting.
Okay, thank you very much. Meeting. Thank you very much, Martin. So welcome everyone. We are very happy to be here, and we are very pleased to have Professor Graham Oppy as our speaker today. So I'm going to say some few words about him. So Professor Oppy is a very influential philosopher of religion in the analytic tradition. He's currently professor of philosophy at Monash University. He's also the chief editor of the Australasian Philosophical Review and associate editor of the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. He's the editor of some very important anthologies, such as the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Philosophy of Religion, 2017, and the Blackwell Companion to Atheism and Philosophy, 2019. He's also the author of several influential books on the philosophy of religion. For instance, his 1996 book on the Ontological Arguments remains to this day one of the most comprehensive books on the theme. So his talk today, which will be about logic and the concept of God, will be partially based on the first chapter of his 2014 book, which is entitled Describing Gods, an Investigation of Divine Attributes, published by Cambridge University Press. So thank you very much, Professor Oppy, for accepting our invitation, even at such an inconvenient time. Now it's 2 a.m. in Australia, so thank you very much. So please, you have the floor now, and I know that you are going to share some slides with us.
Okay, so thank you very much for the kind introduction. It would be nice if I could live up to the billing that you've given me. That's very unlikely given how early in the morning it is here, but we'll see how we go. So I was invited to talk about a topic that had something to do with logic and God. And the topic that I've picked really is more about God than it is about logic. And there are sort of interesting questions that you could ask about the connection between these two things. You could ask, for example, from a certain point of view, the kind of theists who worry about divine aseity, whether logic comes from God, whether it could be that God is somehow or other responsible for making logic or the ground of logic or something like that. I think that that idea is very difficult. I think that if you're going to say that God makes logic, then there's some sense in which God's prior to logic, even if it's only kind of conceptually, but in that conceptual priority, it's hard to make sense of it if it's supposed to be a domain in which logic doesn't apply or doesn't exist or whatever. And there's a kind of Euthyphro problem sort of there. But I don't think that you could spin too much out of that discussion. A different question, which also I might have talked about, though I think I'm even less equipped to talk about it, would be the question about which logic we should use when we're talking about God, or which logic we should use when we're doing philosophy of religion. The standard practice has been in North America and the rest of the Anglo-American world to just use classical logic in discussions. It's not clear that that's the right thing to do. There's some very interesting work being done by, among other people, J.C. Beale and I forgot his first name, Cottonwire. Anyway, they and other people as well, including people in Brazil. I don't think that I have anything very useful to add to that kind of conversation, though I do think that thinking about, it's kind of natural to think about certain worries about omniscience, for example, the kinds of worries that Patrick Grimm raised, which are kind of connected to logical paradoxes, and it kind of makes sense if you think that paraconsistency can help with the paradoxes, that it's going to help with understanding omniscience as well. Anyway, the topic that I've chosen really is just to talk about some questions about concepts of God and questions of definition. So I'm thinking about kind of nominal definitions and real definitions of God. And in some sense, this is a topic in logic. If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia and you look up the entry on definitions, it's written by Anil Gupta, and it's got some logical content. But as I said, really, what I'll be talking about is much more about how we think about God rather than anything that's particularly to do with logic. Okay. Here we go. So what I want to do, I'm going to talk about briefly about the concept of a God, that's lowercase g, then about the concept of God, uppercase G, and then conceptions of God, and the difference between the concept and conceptions I'll explain when we get there. And then I want to talk about three conceptions of God: simple God, or the simple being, the greatest being, and the perfect being, and talk about some difficulties that arise for each of these conceptions. I won't say much about the simple being, but I want to focus on the greatest being and the perfect being. There's a book that Jeff Speaks wrote in which he worries about how much you can get out of the concept of a greatest being, and that's the main thing that I want to talk about, is what Speaks has to say, and then Josh Rasmussen's, in his review of Speaks' book, thinks that maybe you could do better if you think about a perfect being rather than the greatest being in terms of being able to get some substantive content. And I want to raise some questions about that as well. Okay, so off to the beginning. So I think it's not altogether out of the question that you might think that really the lowercase word God is a kind of family resemblance term. So in the same ballpark as Wittgenstein took the word game to be. That is, our competence in being able to use this term really doesn't require us to have either a nominal definition or a real definition of what a God would be. However, for the discussion that's going to come, it's, I think, useful for me to have a stipulative definition of God with a lowercase g, because I think that there's then an interesting nominal definition of God uppercase g that you can make from it. I think that there are two widely attributed features of gods. First of all, there's an association with power, with controlling forces, with being the things that control or have power over everything else. And the other feature is worthiness of veneration, worthiness of worship. So as a kind of stipulative definition, I think that gods are venerable beings that have and exercise power over everything else. And the usefulness of this definition will become clear when we go on to think about what we might take God, uppercase G, to be. I think that it's kind of natural to suppose that something's God, uppercase G, just in case it's the one and only God, lowercase g. So it's something's God just in case it alone has and exercises power over everything else and is worthy of veneration. Now, there are people and traditions that object to this definition. What people want to say when I say this kind of thing is, look, it entails that God's a member of a genus. And if you're a Thomist, for example, you think that that's not on. However, I want to say this definition is purely nominal. It's not giving you an account of the essence or ground of God. It's just meant to be extensionally and intentionally accurate. It's meant to pick out God in this world, in all the possible worlds, assuming that there is a God. And I think that you can suppose that it does that without thinking that in any way we're offering a real definition of God here, that we're saying what the essence of God would be. There's some background here that needs a little bit more unpacking. So I think that when you say that something is an essential property of something, what you're saying is that necessarily if that thing exists, it has that property intrinsically. So the essential properties of things are roughly their necessary intrinsic properties. And then if you look back at my definition, it's clear that having an exercising power over everything else is not an intrinsic property of a thing, right? So it's clear that on the way that I want to think about what essences are, I couldn't pretend that this was a real definition of God. And I don't think that the idea that it's an adequate nominal definition of God's going to be objectionable. Given the concept of God, there's a whole range of different conceptions that you might have, different views that you might have about what the essence of God is, what a real definition of God would look like. I mean, those people who believe that God exists typically have theories of God. That is, they believe a bunch of propositions involving the word God, and they're committed to the logical closure of that bunch of propositions. And from their theory, you might think that you can extract an account of what they take the essence of God to be. Or that from their theory, you might think that you can construct a real definition of God. Not every view about God is going to support such a definition, but some views will. And I want to set aside first the views that won't, and then focus on views that will. So there are some people, apophaticists, who say we can only say what God intrinsically is not. We can't say anything about God's intrinsic properties. So there's one view. Another view, I'm going to call them analogists, say we can only make analogical claims about God's intrinsic properties. We can say sort of what God's intrinsic properties are, but we use words that have a familiar meaning and then have this rather different meaning when they're applied to God. And then there are literalists, people who say we can make well-grounded claims about God's intrinsic properties. And I'm going to go on and understand claims like God is the simple being, or God is the perfect being, or God's the greatest being, as being intended to be literally true, and making some literal claim about the essence of God. First of all, I want to say something about the other two approaches and why I'm not interested in discussing them further in the present context. I think that on the apophatic approach, we're going to be left with no means of justifying the claim that the alleged thing that has an exercises power over us is worthy of veneration. The determination of whether something's worthy of veneration can't be divorced from the determination of its necessary intrinsic properties. If we can only know what something intrinsically is not, we can't have grounds for venerating it, I don't think. So I want to put that one to one side. On the analogical approach, I think we have no means of giving content to the analogical terms that we're allegedly able to employ. If we have no other access to the intrinsic nature of a thing, we have no way of determining whether our application of analogical intrinsic terms to that thing is apt. Putting it a different way, I just deny that there can be any such thing as irreducibly analogical intrinsic predication. So I think on the analogical approach, we run into a dead end as well. From the point of view of pursuing a real definition, right? The people who go for the apophatic approach or the analogical approach won't regard this as any sort of loss, but I'm interested in talking to those people who think that we can give a real definition. Okay, so first thing, some people think that God's the simple being. So some theists say, there are many true things that can be said about what God intrinsically is, but there are no real distinctions that correspond to these many sayings. That there are no intrinsic real distinctions in God is expressed by claims like the following: God's existence is God's essence, God is pure act, God is simple, and so on. If you're familiar with the writings of St. Thomas or any contemporary Thomists, you will have come across formulations like these. Perhaps some of the people who say these sorts of things, so certainly not all of them, might think that more information about what God is intrinsically might be given by claims like the following: God's simple act involves God's perfect power, which God exercises by knowing, and it's the standard of good. But all of the things that I just talked to, there's no real distinction between. I'm not proposing that to discuss this family of views any further, though we could perhaps talk about it in the discussion time if you want to. Obviously, it's a kind of hard saying that we can say these things, but there's no real distinction between the claims that we're making. And I'll just want to leave that topic there. Okay, so on to the main topic that I want to talk about. Some think that we can give an adequate real definition of God in the claim that God's the greatest being, either, I mean, you might say the greatest actual being or the greatest possible being or the greatest conceivable being. And in his book, Jeff Speaks argues that no matter which option we take, we can't derive interesting claims about God from the proposition that God's the greatest being. You just can't do it, he says. And it's his book's really very interesting. And his arguments are very subtle. I'm going to give you a crude version of an argument for the same conclusion here. So here's why I think you're not going to get anything interesting out in the context of the kind of debates that we have in philosophy of religion. So first up, if the actual world is as naturalists suppose it to be, then if there's a greatest being, it's nothing like God, right? The greatest being might be, I don't know, maybe Nelson Mandela, right? I mean, you don't have to take that suggestion seriously, but if you think that natural reality exhausts causal reality and the greatest being is going to be some causal being in there, maybe it'll be a particular person, but it certainly won't be anything like God. And it won't have properties like being omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and so on. If modal space is as those naturalists who suppose that naturalism is necessary take it to be, then the greatest possible being will be nothing like God, right? Perhaps Nelson Mandela, even if he's the greatest actual being, won't be the greatest possible being. But if you think that every world shares the laws of the actual world and shares some history from it, diverges only because chances play out differently, it might be that a being not very different from the actual greatest being is the greatest possible being. And that being too will not be omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, exercising power over all else, etc. On the third possibility about conceivability, we have a choice. There's two ways we can go. if we can't conceive of what's impossible, then the discussion just goes back to the previous discussion, about possibility. If we can conceive of what's impossible, then nothing rules it out that the greatest possible being can't possibly exist. And it's not very interesting if it turns out, because we're kind of committed to impossibilia, that there's an impossible, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being. That's not a conclusion that's really of any religious or theoretical interest. Okay, now, as I said, the argument in Speaks's book is much more subtle than the argument that I've given, but essentially it leads to the same conclusion and it goes by a similar way of examining cases. I want to talk about something that's related briefly. I noticed that there's at least one person in the audience who knows more about this topic than I do, but anyway, I want to talk for a little bit about Gödel's ontological argument. So I've got a presentation of the argument here. So we have 4 premises and a conclusion. So the premises are: if a property is positive, its negation is not positive. If a property is entailed by a positive property, then it too is positive. The property of having all of the positive properties essentially is positive, and the property of existing necessarily is positive. Follows from these 4 claims in a suitable third order modal logic. You can derive it. There is and must be a being that has all of the positive properties essentially. Okay, so there are 2, the premises of here are of 2 kinds. The first 2 premises are kind of a characterization of conditions that the positive properties have to satisfy, and then 3 and 4 are claims about 2 particular examples of positive properties. The key to the proof is that it follows from the first 2 claims that if a property is positive, then it's possibly instantiated. The way the proof goes, very short version of the proof, suppose that you've got a property that's not possibly instantiated. Classically, it entails all properties. So it'll be fine that we're going to have the second condition satisfied, but the first one can't be. If a property is positive, then its negation is not positive. That can't hold for a property that's not possibly instantiated. So if you've got a property that satisfies these 2 conditions, or a set of properties that satisfy this condition, then you've got possible instantiation in the first case of the property, in the second case, co-instantiation of all the properties. Right, now, the way that the lemma worked, the classical trick that it appealed to, namely that if you've got an impossible property, it entails all the rest, is also the reason why this isn't a successful proof. Because, that point was that properties that are not possibly instantiated entail all properties. Well, if it's not possible that there's the greatest possible being, the property of having all the positive properties essentially isn't positive, because it doesn't satisfy the first 2 conditions. If it's not possible that there's a necessarily existing being, then the property of existing necessarily is not positive, right? So those were the 3rd and 4th premises. We were relying on 1 and 2 to get us out a proof that a property was possibly instantiated, but the 3rd and 4th premises require us to assume that the properties are possibly instantiated in order to assert them in the first place. And we can go on, because there's lots of ways that you can expand this proof. You can add more things in to get more properties out. You can suppose that omnipotence is positive. But if it's not possible for omnipotence to be instantiated, then it's just not a positive property. So I think this proof just falls apart. And this is the core of Gödel's ontological argument. Okay, last thing. To mention. In his review of Speaks's book, Rasmussen says, he says some things that I said in describing gods, that maybe you might suppose that a real definition of God is in the claim that God's the perfect being rather than that God's the greatest being. So you might sketch the idea out like this. We start with the idea that there are various excellences, knowledge, virtue, power, and so forth. We suppose that each excellence has an ideal form, perfect knowledge, perfect power, and so on. To have perfect knowledge is to know every truth. To have perfect power is to be able to complete any task that is possible for at least one agent to complete, and so on. We then suppose there's a perfection for overall excellence. A perfect being is one that's perfect with respect to every excellence. So we might say the ideal for a being is that for each excellence, the being is perfect with respect to that excellence, perfectly knowledgeable, perfectly powerful, and so on. And now from the notion of a perfect being, it seems like we can get substantive results out. So that we're not in the position that we were in with the greatest being. So I'm not sure that's right. So I just want to think about some cases. So I'll start with a few cases. So consider neutrality. There's an ideal form of neutrality. Someone who's ideally neutral is such that for any pair of options, they're indifferent between them. A perfectly neutral being is indifferent between any options with which it's presented. Consider human vision. To have ideal human vision is to be able to see as well as it's possible for a human being to see. A human being who sees as well as it's possible for a human being to see has perfect human vision. Consider test results. For tests on which 100% is the best possible performance, just think of a multiple choice test, there is ideal performance. A person who takes the test and gets 100% performs perfectly on the test. Consider learning. There's an ideal form of learning. Someone who learns everything that they can from every learning opportunity that they have is a perfect learner. So you can see where this is going. So the question is, what are the excellences that we should suppose contribute to overall excellence? If we suppose that all excellences contribute to overall excellence, then it seems obvious that overall excellence will be an unattainable ideal. No one thinks that there's a being that has perfect human vision, got perfect scores on their high school test results, is perfectly neutral between all options, and is a perfect learner. Right? That's just not a coherent conception of a being. And I haven't started to throw in lots of other properties that are clearly excellences. Right, and it's clear we do recognise that perfect learning, perfect scores on tests, perfect human vision, perfect neutrality are excellences. So perhaps you might say, you kind of misunderstood what the situation is here. The excellences in questions are ones that will be excellences for any being. Clearly, having perfect human vision needn't be an excellence for non-humans. Getting 100% on particular tests needn't be an excellence for beings that just don't take tests. Being an excellent learner need not be an excellence for beings that have nothing to learn. Okay, well, consider rocks. Rocks are not the kinds of things that are capable of knowledge. Consequently, it's not an excellence for rocks that they be perfectly knowledgeable. If excellences must be excellences for any being, then being perfectly knowledgeable is not an excellence. If being perfectly knowledgeable is not an excellence, then a perfect being will not be perfectly knowledgeable. Okay, so we don't want that result. Consider cats. Cats are not the kinds of things that can be morally good. Consequently, it's not an excellence for cats that they be perfectly morally good. If excellences must be excellences for any being, then being perfectly morally good is not an excellence. being perfectly morally good is not an excellence, then a perfect being will not be perfectly morally good. So we've now got a different blockage to the conclusion that we wanted to get to. We have no reason to think that we can extract the properties that Rasmussen wants to attribute to a perfect being from the concept of a perfect being, unless we first explicitly build some properties into the concept that are going to constrain what the range of excellences are. Perhaps, for example, you might say the perfect being must be an agent, but then we're no longer working with the concept of a perfect being, rather we're working with the concept of a perfect agent. And that certainly seems to be loading the dice in a way that talk about beings wasn't loading the dice when it comes to various things that you might want to do with this concept, like constructing arguments around it. There are, of course, lots of options for real definitions of God. So consider, for example, Swinburne's definition. God's a necessarily existent person without a body who's essentially eternal, perfectly free, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and the creator of all else. One distinctive feature of this definition, when compared to the definitions that we've just been examining, right, the greatest being, the perfect being, maximal being, which goes the same way as the greatest being, and so on, is that it contains vocabulary that naturalists take to be necessarily empty, like omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. Right? That's not to say that there's something wrong with this definition. It's just that it's very clear that this definition sits within a theory, and when you think about a contrasting theory like naturalism, what naturalists will say is there's just lots of empty terms here. What the kind of advantage, the argumentative advantage that being able to talk about the greatest being or the perfect being might have seemed to give is that's a word that the naturalists are going to have a use for too, even if they think that there isn't a greatest being. They might think that there is one. They might think that they can't rule it out. It's just that it's a kind of, there's this big extra step to get you from a naturalist conception of what a perfect being or the greatest being might be to the theistic conception. And I think that's where I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you very much for the very nice talk. So now we open for questions. Okay, there are some virtual hands raised. So I think Alejandro goes first.
No, sorry, I was just clapping. It was not
I'm
a hand
sorry.
raised.
So if you wait a
Sorry.
second, the clapping goes away. So
I got confused. I'm sorry. So Mohammed, you can ask your question.
you're muted.
So, but you wanna ask a question, right? If so, please go ahead.
Just needs to turn his microphone on.
I would like to ask a question, which is
Do it, please do it.
arguments. I missed the first part of Professor Oppy's presentation, but insofar as this derives from St. Anselm's ontological argument, can anyone explain why the ontological argument only includes chapters 2 through 4 of the Proslogion? Because chapter 5 summarizes it and says what it's about. And that is something quite different. It's quid melius est esse quam non esse, whatever it is better to be than not to be. So the idea of all this excellence and so forth in Anselm's formulation of it is not fully relevant, because the excellences are not whatever it is better to be than not to be necessarily. For example, it's better to be alive than to be dead. Okay. and that's not necessarily an excellence, unless aliveness is itself an excellence. So why is it that almost everybody who discusses the ontological argument ignores its conclusion and summary in chapter 5 of the Proslogion? That's my question.
So, I mean, I wasn't, the only argument I talked about was Gödel's argument, and Gödel's argument follows pretty closely the line that Leibniz took when he was, as he saw it, filling a hole in Descartes' argument. And that argument is cast in terms of perfections, right, or excellences. And I agree with you that Anselm's argument is a different argument, right? It's not an argument that works with the same machinery as the kind of argument that Descartes, Leibniz, and Gödel work with. On the question of, on the question about the Proslogion, the way that I read it, there's an argument in Proslogion 2, which establishes the existence of something, and then all of the remaining chapters of the Proslogion establish attributes of that thing, show that it has certain properties. And in some sense, you might think of all of it as just drawing out the consequences of what it is to be that than which no greater can be conceived. So I wasn't sure whether you were suggesting that that way of understanding the Proslogion's mistaken or not.
Well, I would just add here, the Proslogion is clearly divided into 2 parts, chapters 1 through 13, which are rather abstract and you could argue deal with the properties. But chapters 14 through 26, divided in half, 13 chapters each, begins. But now that I have defined this, how do I feel it? How do I experience it? So the rest of it is an experiential argument. I've never seen anybody deal with that either, because he said, how can I smell it, touch it, feel it, hear it, see it? All 5 senses he refers to. And the rest of the 14 through 26 are sensual and concrete in terms of experience. And I've never seen anybody deal with that.
So now I can't remember where the bit where he says that this thing is greater than can be conceived. I can't remember whether that's in 13 or whether it comes a little bit later.
That comes in chapters 2 through 4.
No, it's, I mean, in 2, 3, 4, we have that than which no greater can be conceived. But later we get the idea that you can't conceive this thing at all. It's greater than can be conceived. And it's not clear how that sits with what came before.
But if that is in chapters 2 through 4, which I think it is, then it would still come down to the summation in chapter 5. Whatever is better to be than not to be. Anyway, I'm raising something new here. It might be irrelevant to this discussion, but I just thought I'd toss it in.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So next question, Ali, are you there?
Yeah, can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me? Oh, hello,
Yeah.
Ricardo, and all the friends here. Thanks for your nice presentation. My question is about the very first part of your discussion that was involving the relation between logic and God. I would like to refer to St. Thomas' Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 25, Article 3, to be precise, where he discusses the power of God. And there he seems to be defending the position that what is impossible or out of contradictory is out of the power of the God. So in Thomas' account, it seems that God is confined in the logical sense, and he is not beyond logic. interestingly, he also brings forward an argument against a verse in Holy Bible in Luke 1:37, where it says that for nothing will be impossible with God. So St. Thomas actually argues against the a verse of the Holy Bible. I would like to know your own personal position about the relation between God and logic, whether you believe that God, in any sense that you may consider an appropriate definition, is confined in the realm of logic, or logic goes, God goes beyond logic, and it's actually a metalogical, or in some sense, beyond logical being. Thank you very much.
So Descartes thought that God could do what's impossible, and that always struck me as kind of bizarre. I mean, it always seemed to me that you would want to have a view on which God was constrained by logic, and given that Thomas thinks that, that's a tick for Thomas, right? By my lights.
That would also be a tick for Heidegger in his Introduction to Metaphysics, in which he says, okay, if we want to investigate nothing, we can't do it because that's turning nothing into something, which is a contradiction. And then he says, but logic is only a tool of reason. And if we go beyond logic up to reason, then we can investigate nothing, which he then goes to show is experienced in the experience of anxiety.
So I guess I think that while there's a lot more to reasoning than logic, reasoning's constrained by logic. Good reasoning will be consistent, I think.
Oh,
So I don't think I want to go and follow Heidegger.
okay, good, thank you. So Yasna, is your turn?
No, I was I heard with my contribution about the morality of cats or not before?
I think so.
Sorry, I didn't get it. I was not sure. This is the question for Professor Oppy.
At which one? Because I have written one, and then I was also before speaking. I was speaking about this example of a cat's morality, which is not valid, I think, in this reasoning, because cats are basically moral. So we cannot remove this fact from nature. Simply.
Right. So I think it's hard to view cats as moral. I think of them as amoral. They just sort of lie outside the scope of the moral, and I think that would be a fairly standard view to take about them. So we don't criticize cats for torturing mice for their own pleasure, because we just think that they don't fall within the moral sphere.
I think it's difficult to apply human standards of morality to animals, because they are a stage of evolution. So the safest option would be to talk about God using human examples, and also I wrote my definition, my proposal of God, which is love, peace and love, and of course, as derived from reasoning and order. To balance heart with mind, of course.
So there is a division of opinion amongst theists about the extent to which you should base your idea of God on ideas of humanity. Right. So for some people, anthropomorphism is an awful sin. For other people, it's the only possibility. and there are kind of sectarian divides in Christianity, and I expect in other theistic religions as well, depending on the stance that you take on this question.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So Mohammed, now it's your turn.
I can't hear.
We can't hear you, Mohammed. We can't hear you. You have something? Okay. So I think he's gonna come back. So Marcin, you can ask us your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I would like to refer to the very beginning of this presentation where you have listed 3 options like apophaticism, analogists, or apophaticists, analogists, and literalists. Do you consider it possible to mix these positions? And I think that Aquinas would be a good example because, in fact, he is a kind of literalist because he says God is simple. But in the preface, just before the question 3 of the first part, sorry, in this preface, he says, okay, now let's deal with God's essence. But in fact, we cannot say anything positive about God's essence. We can say he's simple, but in fact, we are negating because we are talking about him as not composed. Yeah. So from on one hand, he is literal because he said God is simple, but in fact, the content of this concept is that he is not composed. Another thing it's completely another thing are the God's names from the question 13. And then he becomes analogists, yeah, because he says we cannot understand what is goodness of God. What does it mean that God is wise? We cannot be treated as something univocal or equivocal, but we have to go the middle way, like analogy. So this is another thing. In fact, Aquinas combines all these approaches, and my question is, would it have some impact on your conclusions if you take such an example?
So I don't think so. When I discussed what I call the simple view, I pointed out that there were kind of different ways that you could read it. I assume that when Aquinas, contemporary Thomists say that God is pure act, that actually is pointing to an essential property. They're talking about, because it's not like they don't think that God has an essence, it's just that they think that there's an identity between God's essence and God's existence. So, and I think that when they say that God's pure act, they mean that to be understood literally. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Should be understood literally or not?
I believe it should be. They think that it should be understood.
Okay,
literally.
but in Aquinas' view, it is not. When we say he is a pure act, in fact, we cannot imagine. We cannot imagine. It's a bad word, but we intellectually grasp what does it mean to be a pure act. In fact, we know what is to be composed from matter and form, but to be just a form or a pure act, in fact, we cannot grasp intellectually what it is. So this is his point. Yeah. So okay, thank you for this.
I'm kind of worried about that, though. Contemporary Thomists maybe don't all follow Aquinas on that point, because it feels like you're going to saw off the branch on which you're sitting if you because now the question becomes, well, how am I supposed to understand these words that you're using?
Yeah, sure. This is a problem. Yeah. But in fact, it's a special middle way and a bit problematic, I guess. For this reason, for example, I introduced a new concept of non-concepts. So we have some non-concepts when thinking about God, because it is a kind of concept, but not full one. Not
so, but to go back to your question, I agree that there are kind of mixed forms, but I don't think it makes any difference. What I wanted to do was to set stuff aside and just focus on the kind of discussion that Speaks' book is aimed at. And he's clearly not talking to Thomas in the discussion that he's giving. Yeah.
This is what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay, good. So Mohammed is back. So let's see if his mic is working now.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Eventually, huh? Sorry. In the case or in the problem of existence of God, we often focus at this lecture upon the idea of God. I think in such case, we should focus upon the term of existence. I always think that the problem rely upon the implicit or concealed meaning of existence, which we adopt when we talk about the existence of God. I think also that the controversial point of ontological argument was rely upon the meaning of existence, nothing more. Yeah. Then my question, why we don't focus about the implicit meaning of existence, which we use when we talk about the existence of God, and focus on the concept of God, if we have a capability to distinguish between existence and existence.
So in the literature on ontological arguments, lots of people have spent lots of pages talking about existence and different conceptions of existence. And there have been people who've thought that the key to ontological arguments was to understand the way that we use the word exists, or the way that we should use it correctly. So for Frege, existence is a kind of second order concept. And once you've kind of got that, you can see that no ontological arguments can work, according to both Frege and Russell. So I don't think that it's right to say that, and if you go back to Kant's criticism, also, Kant thought that where ontological arguments went wrong really had to do with the way that they were treating the term exists. So I think this is a well-established idea in the literature on ontological arguments. I think you're right that it's something that deserves careful attention.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So Marie, it's now your turn.
My turn?
No, it's no, you're next. It's Marie Duzy. Are you there? Sorry for that. I think she's not there.
Yeah.
Okay. So please ask your question or make your comment.
Me or Maria?
You, Duzy.
Thank you. First of all, many thanks for a nice talk. But if you don't mind, I would like to come back to St. Anselm because there is a very simple, clear argument in Proslogion 3, of which he proved that it is logically valid. And in this argument, St. Anselm does not presuppose anything about the essence of God. St. Anselm addresses God in a very, very modest way, that die to whom nothing greater is conceivable. And from this, I think that we cannot assume anything about the essence of God, and of this, this gave rise to currently very popular negative theology. Negative not in a pejorative sense. We just presuppose that God is love and the sense of our lives, and that's all, and that God is a secret. And it even corresponds, I would say, to to the view of Buddhists, because something that could be perhaps comparable to our concept of God is that eternal, timeless cosmic consciousness, and this cosmic consciousness is the origin and cause and creator of everything. And it also corresponds to St. John. At the beginning was Logos, and the translation of the Logos, in my opinion, is not correct. It's something like that cosmic consciousness, or so. As since back to Anselm's argument in Proslogion 3, as I said in João Pessoa, I believe that I presented that talk, and I showed why this argument is really logically valid. So that what can we do with it? Because actually, for us believers, it is not acceptable that the existence of God could be logically provable, because then God wouldn't be a secret anymore, and all the churches would finish, would lose its sense. So that if the argument is valid, then what can we do? We can only raise some doubt about some of Anselm's premises, and he thus raise doubt against the premise that necessary existence contributes to the greatness of God. And he says that it's just vice versa, because necessary existence gets contra greatness. The greater, I think that many authors agree that the term God denotes a role or a thing to be, so that the greater the thing to be is, the more demandable it is, so that the less occupied it is, so that the essence of the role to be with necessary existence would be poor, would be gray, completely uninteresting. So that it was just a comment that in my opinion, all we can assume is that God is love and God is the sense of our life, and I would really prefer Anselm's very modest addressing God, "Thy to whom nothing greater is conceivable." So he doesn't presuppose anything about the essence of God, anything else. So just a comment, or what do you think about it, or question, or I don't know how to maybe comment.
Okay, thanks. So I think of, people have different ideas about the way in which Proslogion 2 and Proslogion 3 are related to one another. I think that in Proslogion 2, Anselm takes himself to show that there exists something than which no greater can be conceived.
But I'm talking about Proslogion 3.
And in Proslogion 3, he shows that this thing, as he says, exists so truly that it can't even be conceived not to exist. And some people have taken Proslogion 3 and turned it into a self-standing argument. So the thought was that somehow or other Proslogion 2 is a sort of non-modal argument, and Proslogion 3 is something like a modal argument, the kind of argument that in different ways people like Norman Malcolm and Charles Hartshorne developed. I'm inclined to think that those arguments are not in the text, they're just kind of suggested by the text, that Hartshorne and in particular kind of made up his argument, but he was inspired to make it up by his reading of Anselm's text. So I don't think that really there's an independent argument in part 3. I also think that, of course, if you think,
you don't think that the argument in Proslogion 3 is what? You don't think what?
that it's in the text. I don't think that that something like Hartshorne's argument is in the text, but if you think about the kind of standard modal ontological argument in its kind of simple form, it's possible that God exists necessarily. If God exists necessarily, so God exists. You're right to say that that's a valid argument, but it's also an argument that's
I'm not talking about
that's not persuasive.
I'm not talking about that classical ontological argument. That's the same like Descartes and Gödel, etc., etc. I'm talking about that simple, die to whom nothing greater is conceivable, exists so truly and actually that it is not thinkable that you would not exist. And now it is thinkable that there is something, the non-existence of which is not thinkable. And this thing is greater than anything, the non-existence of which is thinkable. Hence, if it were thinkable that die to whom nothing greater is conceivable might not exist, then die to whom nothing greater is conceivable would not be die to whom nothing greater is conceivable contradiction. That's the whole argument. There is no word about positive properties, essence, nothing like that. Except it's probably logically valid. I've proved it as well.
So it's an interesting question whether the argument in Proslogion 2 is valid, and it's an interesting question whether the argument in Proslogion 3 is valid. The reason why it's a kind of interesting and perhaps still open question whether the argument in Proslogion 2 is valid is because of parodies of the argument, which suggests that if it works, you can establish the existence of all kinds of other perfect things like perfect islands and so on.
There is a logical mistake in the argument of Proslogion 2, and in all the other Descartes, Gödel, etc., ontological arguments. It can be easily found.
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, that depends upon thinking that you can say very easily what the argument is, but it's not all easy to say what the argument is.
I analyzed that, and I got a paper on that topic, and it's provable. It's logical. It can be rigorously analyzed, and you will discover a logical mistake in all the other ontological arguments, except of this one in Proslogion 3.
May I interject? I mean, the discussion is wonderful. The topic is wonderful, but I'd like to suggest perhaps, unless we have a board or something like that, I think we won't be able to have a fruitful discussion. So if you allow me, I'd like to allow the next person to discussion. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good, wonderful. So the next question in line is myself, but Professor Walensky, he's not able to raise his virtual hand, so now he has the floor. He can ask this question.
Okay, I have two remarks about this Gödel's argument and similar. These God's properties are very schematic. In fact, for example, take simplicity. What does it mean? For example, what is the relation between God's will and God's knowledge? If God is simple, and so these two properties are identical. But if they are identical, so morally speaking, it is a devastating several points of Christians, for example, any other morality because God knew about Auschwitz means that he also wanted or liked that it should be heaven. I will not enter into discussion. However, I only remark that this problem of God's properties is not easy. But about Gödel's argument. Okay, assume that we have that we define all positive properties. And we have a set of sentences about these positive properties. So according to metalogic or metamathematics, there is a model for these properties because this set is consistent. However, it doesn't mean that the being which possesses all properties exists in an intuitive sense. Moreover, if we use Lindenbaum's maximalization principle, we have also practically Gödel used this technique that there is a maximal set of positive properties or positive sentences about these properties, and of course this set has also a model, but it doesn't imply anything about essentiality or necessity. Moreover, in order to prove that this being is unique, so there is only one God, requires an assumption that this theory is complete. I mean, that set of positive properties, its maximal set is complete, but is not quite clear. Anyway, if someone claims that set of positive properties implies essentiality and necessity, this reasoning requires a special modal logic, very strong, even stronger than S5 or S4, certainly, because so-called Gödel's rule that if A is true, it is also necessarily true, which is very problematic. So I think there's several logical objections against this line of reasoning. So, in my opinion, this negative theologic, or what you call analogists, is the only way of speaking, maybe not consistently, but at least coherently in a very rough sense. However, analogy means that practically we don't know how to use. Take, for example, that God is a creator, created the world. Well, but it doesn't mean creation in our sense, because creation to create means to change something, or to change. Creator changes what is not proper with respect to God. So, analogical theology practically falls into negative theology after a closer inspection. And finally, I discussed this problem with many priests in Poland, and this discussion usually ended with the following remark of, okay, but you must believe in it. If you believe, everything is clear. So I resigned from the further discussion because I don't believe. And for this reason, it is not clear for me. Thank you.
So I think you're definitely right that there's lots of background questions that you can ask about the logic that Gödel himself was using when he first wrote down the argument in his notebooks, as was pointed out by people who looked into the system when he first developed it. It seemed that it was subject to a certain kind of rather catastrophic collapse. But people have found ways of reconstructing the argument that avoids the difficulties that faced Gödel's original formulation. I agree with you that the logic is quite strong, and there's all kinds of people who would find it problematic, because it's not just that it's a strong modal logic, but it's also a higher order logic as well. And there have been famous objectors to both of those things historically. So maybe that's enough by way of comment. Thanks for what you said.
Okay, thank you. So it's now my turn. So I have two questions. In fact, I'd like to come to go back to the beginning of your presentation when you define God as superhuman beings who are to be worshipped because they hold and exercise power over people, over natural world. And then you define God, capital G, as the one and only God, right? So the first question is, I mean, it seems that defining God like that, capital G, you are excluding views that are shared by many religions, that there are other powerful beings other than God, but he's the most powerful. Perhaps even in Christianity, angels, they exercise some power over human beings, and definitely in many Eastern traditions you have that. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Can I say something to that? God has power over the angels. So God, the idea was that God sits right at the top of the hierarchy. And that will be true in Christianity, it's true in Islam, where you also have angels and so on. And it's true sometimes in some of the Eastern religions.
Yeah, but it seems that when you define God as the one and only God, it seems that you are excluding those beings, those powerful beings, right?
So, well, angels are not gods. It's a different question because there's a kind of language problem here. It depends, and it depends, say, in Hinduism, whether you think that there is, a God that sits above, I don't know, Shiva or
yes,
but
the other
deities or not.
Even angels, they will fit your definition of gods if they are venerable. And if they have some superhuman power, they will be gods also.
So I didn't say superhuman power. I just said that they had power over everything else, right?
Oh.
And they don't have power over God.
Okay, because I'm looking at your book, in fact, and here you said that gods are superhuman beings who are to be worshipped because they hold and exercise power over the natural world.
Right. So that wasn't the definition that I used in
I know.
the talk, and I regret putting the word superhuman in there.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you very much. The second question, if you allow me. You didn't speak about your distinction between concept of God and conception of God, because it seems that you defend the idea that there is only one concept of God, but there might be several conceptions of God. Could you elaborate on that?
So I was thinking that what I call the concept of God, we'll just do as a kind of nominal definition, but there's lots of different real definitions that you might give according to the beliefs that you've got about what God's like. That was what I was thinking. So I was thinking that it's a kind of satisfactory nominal definition. It's just telling you that there's, if God exists, then there is something that has and exercises power over everything else, and it's worthy of worship, but it doesn't tell you anything about its intrinsic properties. And then particular conceptions of God may or may not fill in intrinsic properties, but they will fill in more properties.
But then you reject the idea that there might be different concepts of God. Am I right?
Well, I started with a stipulation, right? I think it's useful to kind of organize ideas around something. And so the kind of defining God with a capital G as the one and only God with a small g is useful for fixing ideas for discussion. It's not a kind of, but it's a way of organizing a terrain for discussion. It's not that I don't think there's anything very substantive that hangs on it. And if you've got some other way of defining, some other nominal definition of God, we could probably run with it and have the same discussion. Sure.
Okay, thank you. So Maria, now it's your turn.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if I got it right, but this is a question based on what you said at the end, like in your conclusion, and it's connected to what you were discussing about rocks and cats. So basically, I was thinking whether what you were implying in your conclusion is that the sort of perfect being position that we have is like not only the metaphysical attributes that God must possess, but also like the religious description of God that is traced back to the monotheistic religions?
Well, I guess that, I mean, surely that's where it comes from. So, I mean, I don't know that I don't quite know how to respond to what you've asked. I'm not sure what you're asking me to say. There's lots and lots of different ways that people talk about God in different religions, and I mean in the monotheistic religions. Even amongst those people who are not kind of drawn towards the apophatic or that kind of analogical. So just in the discussion in contemporary philosophy of religion in North America, you get very different pictures of God being defended by different people. And I presume that that's related to the different, what's the word? The word's not sects, the different types of Protestant Christianity there are. So Calvinists versus Lutherans versus Methodists, you know, there's lots and lots of different conceptions of God that are connected to the religions. Denominations, that's the word I was looking for. It's really late.
Yeah, my question was more because it seems as if maybe I misunderstood, but you were considering several attributes or possible perfections, and maybe many of them are ruled out when you're already considering the perfect being as the perfect being of the monotheistic religions. Do you see what I mean? Does it make sense?
I think that's right. I mean, I was assuming that you would recognize that, but that in a way, that's the point I wanted to make. If you just start with the notion, I mean, it's easier to see it. If you start with the notion of the greatest being, what you think falls under that depends upon your broader conception about what things there are, or you know, the greatest possible being. It depends upon your conception of what you think the range of possibility is, and the theistic views have, theistic views have a very different conception of what greatest being might be, or greatest possible being might be, than someone who's not a theist.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. So the next one is Tino Jakozic.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Oppy. Now, just some couple of questions, if you're allowed, hopefully short. About the nominal definition, I know Stephen Adler has this kind of old article on whether Spinoza's God is God. You know, Spinoza's God with a capital G is God with a capital G. And he says it's not because among other things, you can't worship Spinoza as God, right? Now Yitzhak Melamed criticizes, I think, that article by saying, well, this is a very kind of Anglo-Protestant conception of God. Basically, I mean, but my question is, even with this nominal definition, if we look at Spinoza's project as teaching us what God really is and showing us that God should not be worshipped, right? It seems to me that this nominal definition is kind of limited to discussing a certain religious conception, of tetragrammaton or something like that. Now that's nothing in principle against that. It's just a kind of question of clarification, because there are philosophical conceptions which would say, well, no, this is what God is, but you don't worship this thing, right? What religious people are talking about is not something you should worship, but then if you allowed some more, I think I misunderstood your talk. I realized halfway through, because I thought you're gonna criticize Speaks by saying, well, you don't get anything interesting from the concept of perfect being if you load it with omniscience, omnipotence, and stuff like that. If you keep to your nominal definition, you can get something interesting. But towards the end, I think you're not arguing for that. So just my question for that is, so you would basically agree that you can't get anything interesting from the concept of perfect being or not? I just didn't get it.
So I was thinking, Speaks has a pretty convincing case that you can't get anything interesting from greatest being alone. There's a button, you have to feed in a bunch of other stuff to get stuff out. And I think the same is true for perfect being, right? And that really, if you're kind of going down this route, you do much better to start with something like perfect agent rather than perfect being, because that loads in some of the kind of stuff that you want, moral attributes, intelligence, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and then follow up on that. That's very helpful. Thank you. So the examples you gave about, kind of, was it? I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately. Perfect stones, perfect rocks, moral cats, and things like that.
Yeah.
I was wondering, where do we derive, at least in contemporary discourse, these notions of perfections and excellence? Because it seems to me that if you look at the kind of older discourses, like, I don't know, in Augustine, well, we know that excellence is, for example, to have an intellect, while not to have an intellect is a privation, right? To be moral is, to be good is a positive thing, as a real thing. To be evil is privation. If we look at, I don't know, Wolff and kind of Kant discourse, the idea is that perfection is first metaphysically defined rather than derived from, common discourse of what is perfect, what is excellent, and stuff like that. So it seems to me that the discourse at the moment takes these concepts of perfection, excellence from kind of common sense understanding, while when these arguments were developed, maybe ideally speaking, the concepts of perfection look at the first metaphysical concept, which is then applied to theistic arguments, if you see what I mean. So
it might have gone a different way, though. You might have started with, I think these are the kinds of attributes that God has, or that it's appropriate to give to God, and they're the ones that we'll call the excellences, right? It's at least as likely that it goes that way.
I know, but that's not that interesting. I think if we
but
that,
well,
yeah.
well, when you say it's not interesting, I mean it is if you're thinking that that's actually how the argument was put together, because now it doesn't look like it's going to be a very persuasive argument to anybody who hasn't already bought into the picture, right?
Mm-hmm. But then we don't have a kind of you don't think that we should have like a metaphysics of excellence preceding the argument, or metaphysics of perfection?
So in describing gods, I think in the chapter on the discussion of excellence, there's a discussion to be had, right, about how we're going to define up our notion of excellence. That's what my chapter is about. I don't think that you get it out of metaphysics, right? I mean, it's not like it's kind of given to you. And so the notion that I was working with was the one that said that that was one that I guess in your terms has a kind of common sense starting point, but I'm not sure where else you would start. I mean, I have an idea about what excellence would be on a multiple choice test, for a horse and so on. And I'm going to draw on that.
And a comment on the first question, if you don't mind, on being worthy of worship.
Yeah.
No,
if you might ask the question again.
No. So my first question was that basically the one of your nominal properties of God is the worthiness of worship.
Oh, so this was the question about Spinoza.
I mean, Spinoza was a kind of framing device, but
yeah.
But in a sense, if we have conceptions of God such as in Spinoza, which claim to tell us something about God, both metaphysically and religiously, but also are claiming that worship is not supposed to be the part of it, it seems to me that this nominal definition cannot capture these kind of philosophical approaches.
So I'm wondering, I'm not familiar enough with what Spinoza says about worship. So I imagine that he didn't like religion much. And maybe that has something to do with what he was thinking of as worship, rather than some sort of appropriate attitude towards God, an attitude of reverence, something like that. Did Spinoza think that we shouldn't venerate what he called God? In that sense, have a respectful attitude towards it, or something like that.
Worship.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. So now our last question, Summer Sen, please. Are you there? Okay.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you first of all for the lecture. Very informative. So as I have understood the approaches you have considered, these approaches are characterized by an initial assumption regarding excellence or greatness. So it starts, the argumentative starting point is a definition of God, either of his essence, or this might be analogical as well. But what do you think about approaches that have a theologically neutral starting point and progress towards a definition of God by more argumentative steps? And examples I'm thinking of is more in ancient times of Ibn Sina's arguments for God's existence. He starts with the notion of being, then purports that a being might be caused or uncaused, and then eventually he presumes he shows the existence of an uncaused cause of all the rest. And then he proceeds to show from that notion of independence of that uncaused cause, more traditional attributes like uniqueness. He says that this uncaused cause must be one, must be unique, if it is indeed necessary in the sense he takes this. And more contemporary examples would be that of Edward Feser, who is in his book 5 Proofs of God's Existence, also purports that from his arguments that he regards as theologically neutral, he can also show further features of that being which caused reality outside himself.
Okay, so I agree that those arguments, those causal arguments, are theologically neutral. They might prove the existence of no more than a necessary initial state of natural reality. and it would take a significant argument to show that they prove more than that. This is a theme that I've pursued at some length in things that I've published in the last decade or so. I think that there are no cosmological arguments that get you to God. They don't, it's not obvious that they get you to anything that a naturalist can't accept. So I'm quite happy just to say yes.
Okay. Okay, so we have to close the session now. Professor Oppy must be very, very tired. So thank you again. Thank you, all of you, for attending our webinar. If by chance you have some additional question, you can write in the chat. Okay, we are gonna leave the room open for a few extra minutes, so we'll be able to write your questions. And that's it. So I think Assis, he has a very short announcement to make. So please, Assis. And again, thank you very much. We see hopefully each other in 1 month from now. So please, Assis.
Can I say something first?
Oh, of course. Go ahead, Professor Oppy.
So I just wanted to say thanks for inviting me and thanks for all the questions. I hope that I managed to answer them somewhat coherently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you again, Professor Oppy, for your willingness to help us participate, to answer all those questions. Thank you again to everyone who is attending the series of webinars. We have having a fruitful discussion here. And as Professor Ricardo said, we meet again in 1 month, okay? So in the next webinar will be in January. We'll have Purushottam Abhilamora, who will talk about the logical dimension of Hinduism. And we'll have a nice discussion from an Hinduist point of view, okay? So hope to see you again. It will be on January 13 of next year, okay? Thank you very much.